It started like a whisper in a small town that loved appearances more than truth. A place where manicured lawns and white picket fences told only half the story. Behind the clean driveways and cheerful greetings was a hierarchy, one carefully guarded by people who measured worth not in character, but in skin and status. Marcus Johnson had grown up in this town, though he'd never truly been welcomed. His grandfather had bought the land decades earlier, at a time when black families were quietly discouraged through zoning, red tape, and outright threats from owning property in such exclusive spaces. But his grandfather was stubborn. He had served his country, fought in wars abroad, and came back believing that the soil beneath his feet should belong to him as much as anyone else. So, he bought the patch of land that sat on the far edge of what would one day become a gated, resort-like community. That land came with a barn, a wide, weathered structure, its beams dark with age and history. For Marcus, the barn wasn't just wood and nails. It was where he'd learned to swing a hammer beside his father, where his family gathered during storms, where his grandfather told stories late into the night about resilience and dignity. Every corner held a memory. Every splinter in the old wood was part of his family's story. By the time Marcus inherited the property in his late 30s, the town around it had changed. Wealth had crept in like ivy, spreading through lakeside developments, vacation homes, and a sprawling resort that marketed itself as a sanctuary for rest and leisure. The barn stood as an odd survivor, unpolished, unapologetically rustic next to neatly trimmed houses and glistening docks. To Marcus, it was home. To the homeowners association that ruled the area, it was an eyesore. The HOA wasn't just a board of concerned neighbors. It was a machine built on control. Rules about paint colors, mailbox shapes, even the type of flowers you could plant filled their thick binder of regulations. And while other families were gently nudged into compliance, Marcus felt something harsher. Letters slipped into his mailbox with words like property devaluation and community standards, anonymous notes, unsigned, urging him to do the right thing and tear down the barn. Fines appeared for supposed violations: grass an inch too high, trash bins placed too close to the road, barn doors that creaked too loudly. Marcus wasn't naive. He knew why he was targeted more fiercely than others. He saw it in the tight smiles that disappeared as soon as he turned his back. He heard it in the way some neighbors' voices stiffened when they said his name. His family had held onto land in a place where people like them weren't supposed to. And for the HOA, his barn became the perfect excuse to remind him of that. Still, Marcus resisted. Every time they pressed, he pushed back. He fixed the roof of the barn, repainted its doors, and mowed the grass with precision. He wasn't about to let them erase what his grandfather had built. The barn, to Marcus, wasn't negotiable. It was the last standing testament to his family's fight to belong. But the HOA wasn't just interested in aesthetics. Behind their obsession with community image lay another motive: the lake. The resort community had been built around a man-made lake, shimmering under the sun, its surface dotted with sailboats and jet skis. Tourists came in the summer, filling the rental cabins and lining the restaurants. The lake wasn't just water, it was profit, prestige, and the heartbeat of the town's reputation. Few people remembered or cared that the dam feeding the lake had been built by laborers like Marcus's grandfather, who had worked through blistering summers to make sure the water held. What mattered now was that the lake was the community's jewel, and Marcus's barn, standing just uphill, reminded people of something they wanted erased: that the land hadn't always been theirs. The letters turned into summons. HOA representatives began showing up unannounced, knocking on his door with their clipboards and polite but icy smiles. They framed their demands as favors. If you'd just take down the barn, Marcus, you'd be making life easier for everyone. When he refused, their tone hardened. Words like condemnation and safety violation began appearing in official documents. One afternoon, he came home to find a bright orange notice nailed to the barn door, scheduled for removal: non-compliance with HOA standards. Marcus's stomach sank. He had seen this play before. First came the notices, then the bulldozers. That night, he sat alone in the barn, the scent of hay and old wood heavy in the air. His fingers traced the carved initials his father had once left in a corner beam. He thought of family gatherings, of his grandfather's voice, deep and steady, saying, "They can take many things from you, boy, but never let them take your roots. The roots were right here." And now, they were under attack. Marcus wasn't a man prone to anger, but the injustice gnawed at him. He paid his dues. He maintained his property. He lived quietly. Yet, still, they came. Still, they wanted more. It was no longer about the barn, it was about control, about erasing his family's presence from a place they had every right to be. And so, for the first time, Marcus allowed himself to think of something he had always avoided. Just downhill, tucked into the earth like a secret, was the dam's control valve. Few knew it was there. Fewer still remembered that Marcus's grandfather had once been responsible for maintaining it. But Marcus knew. He had walked past it. As a boy, his father warning him never to touch it. He knew what it could do if opened. The lake would drop, its polished shores turning to mud, the docks left stranded in air. The resort would be crippled. It was unthinkable, dangerous, reckless. And yet, sitting in the silence of his barn, Marcus couldn't help but wonder, what would happen if he stopped playing by their rules? What would happen if, just once, he reminded them that their power was built on fragile ground? The thought lingered in his mind, heavy as stone. He shook it away, but it returned, again and again, louder each time. The HOA pressed him harder. The barn was scheduled to be demolished in just weeks. The letters were piling up. His phone buzzed with thinly veiled threats from numbers he didn't recognize. And beneath it all was the valve, waiting, silent, holding back the one thing the community prized most. Marcus wasn't sure what he would do yet, but he knew one thing. If they took his barn, something inside him would break. And if it broke, he wasn't sure what might follow. The night air was heavy when he stepped out of the barn, the lake shimmering in the distance. He stared at its still waters, imagining what lay beneath, imagining how quickly everything could change. For now, he walked back to his house, trying to steady his thoughts. But deep inside, a seed had been planted. And once planted, some seeds never stopped growing. The orange notice didn't just announce a demolition date. It announced an intention. It said, in the clean serif type of official stationery, that some lives are considered collateral for someone else's comfort. Marcus Johnson read it again the next morning, then the next, as if the words might change if he stared long enough. They didn't. The barn was scheduled to be removed. The timeline was precise. The language was clinical. The goal was unmistakable. He tried the channels that the town liked to call proper. He filed appeals, sat through tight-smiled meetings, listened to short presentations about neighborhood cohesion and visual continuity. He watched a man laser point through a slideshow that never once mentioned the people who had built on this land before the lake homes existed, let alone the men who had poured the dam by hand. Each time the discussion returned to numbers: resale value, sight lines, projected losses. Each time the subtext hung heavier than the words: the barn doesn't fit the picture. The owner doesn't either. The pressure shifted from paper to presence. Neighbors began to walk their dogs slower past his fence. Some lifted phones that glinted in the sun, pretending to scroll while their cameras peered over the wire. A drone buzzed one afternoon, dipping low enough to rattle the tin roof of his shed before zipping back toward the water like a guilty thought. At the gas station, conversation quieted when he stepped in. At the hardware store, faces that knew. His name went blank and distant, like windows tinted overnight. The mailbox became a barometer of contempt. Official envelopes with seals, anonymous notes without signatures. The printed letters cited unapproved structure, hazard to community view, and diminished aesthetic value. The handwritten scraps were blunter. Sell. You don't belong here. Make it easy on yourself. The spray paint on the barn came near sunset, the crimson letters swollen and ragged against old wood. Eyesore. Leave. He scrubbed at it with solvent until his arms trembled, until the paint thinned to a bruise that wouldn't disappear. He filed a police report that felt like a ritual rather than a remedy. The officer nodded, wrote, assured. Nothing changed. The drone returned. The notes kept coming. The drone came again with a different sound. Smoother, newer, as if someone had upgraded their interest in him. Work on the land became a kind of prayer. He mowed in level rows, etched a fence line, repaired a hinge and then a joist, replaced a cracked pane in the house he had patched a dozen times before. Each task was a refusal to surrender. Each nail he set into weathered wood was an act of memory, a way of telling the ground he wouldn't abandon it. But the rituals of care could not stop the machinery of erasure that was already set in motion. He went to a town forum because the notice had promised community input. The room smelled like lemon polish and staged hospitality. He took a seat in the back and listened as the board presented a tidy version of reality. Speak of dangerous precedent and shared standards. Leave out trespasses, drones, red paint. A resident stood to say the barn made the lakeside feel less curated. Another described worrying patterns since Marcus had changed how he uses his land, as if his very presence were an unpredictable weather event. Not once did anyone speak of history, or the difference between beauty and belonging, or the way rules turn into weapons when the rule makers never fear being ruled. He left before the vote because the outcome was written in their posture. Outside, a summer storm gathered, the air thick and electric. The lake wore its evening calm like a costume. Down the slope, past brush and rock, the dam waited in its trench, patient as a lock on a door that someone else had closed. As a boy, he had walked this path with his father, who had taught him to listen to the low language of water, how an extra hiss in the runout meant pressure building, how a slow shudder in the metal meant you eased half a turn and then waited, never rushed. The wheel itself had always looked older than it was, rust sandpapered by weather into something that looked fragile and proved stubborn. His father had said the same thing, smiling without mirth. Sometimes what looks fragile knows exactly how to hold. He stood above it now with rain beginning to stitch the air shut. The wheel stared up like an unblinking eye. Even the storm held its breath. He didn't touch it. Not that night. He just let the idea stand beside him, shoulder to shoulder, like a twin he had spent years pretending he didn't know. Morning brought a new tactic. 3 men in collared shirts and expensive boots walked the perimeter of his barn with clipboards. They moved with the confidence of people who expected every gate to open for them. He stepped outside, said nothing, watched them measure and point and document. They left without looking him in the eye, as if acknowledgement might grant him a legitimacy they preferred to deny. The next day, a letter from his insurer arrived. We regret to inform you, the barn, they claimed, constituted increased risk. Coverage would be adjusted accordingly. Fees would rise. Certain protections would lapse. He called and sat through hold music that never ended in help. He hung up and ran a thumb beneath the edge of his grandfather's pocket knife until the sting reminded him he was still here. A black SUV began appearing at the edge of his property in the late afternoons. Sometimes it idled, sometimes it didn't. Its windows refused to offer a face, just his own reflection, made small and distorted by glass. He kept working. He fixed a fence post. He replaced a mailbox flag the storm had snapped. He let the SUV be a shadow that he carried to bed. Sleep narrowed to a slit. He would drift and jolt awake, chased out of dreams by the sound of machinery that existed only in the mind until the day it didn't. He walked his land at night with a flashlight, the beam swinging across grass and dirt and the low stone wall his grandfather had stacked by hand. He learned the sounds his place made, the soft scrape of a possum, the startled wing beat of a quail, the pure absence that means someone is there. On the 4th night after the forum, that absence stood on his porch. It left a scorch the size of a boot and a rag wedged into the rail where flame had bitten and failed. The smell of smoke clung to the wood like a verdict. He stamped and doused and stood in the dark with his heart hammering against a rib cage that felt newly borrowed. The police came, took photographs, took notes, took their time. He watched them leave and understood something that didn't require language. There are fires the town rushes to put out, and there are flames it lets flicker as warning. Something tightened in him. Not like a fist, but like a knot pulled snug. Over time, the knot had threads from every letter, every drone, every look that refused to know him. It had strands from the officer's shrug, from the spray paint scab across his barn, from the way the black SUV made his driveway feel like a stage. That knot sat in his chest and turned from ache to anchor. He tried even then to be the man he had been taught to be, steady, careful, measured. He called a lawyer whose voice sounded tired. He went to the county office to ask about permits the HOA had cited. A clerk in a blue cardigan dismissed him with practiced finality. He stopped to buy screws and came out to find his truck dusted with a fine film of powder that made the windshield wipers scream. He wiped it away with the rag that still smelled faintly of smoke. Each day brought a smaller cut designed to bleed him of patience. A citation for trash cans visible from the road. A warning about commercial activity because he sold eggs to a neighbor. A notice that his right-of-way access across a strip of HOA land would be under review, which meant rescinded once the vote was tallied by the same people who kept moving the border of what counted as reasonable. He went to the lake at dusk and watched the water behave as if it owed no one a thing. Wind brushed its surface into a low shiver. The resort lights came on, soft and staged, spilling gold across a shoreline cultivated to look wild. Somewhere a child laughed. Somewhere a glass clinked. The sound came across the water perfectly, as if the air itself had been leveled. He thought of his grandfather, shoulders squared in an old photograph, standing by a dam that was still new. He thought of his father, palms black with grease, telling a boy that some machinery asks for respect, not fear. He thought of how many times he had bent so the storm wouldn't snap him, and how many times bending had been mistaken for consent. The demolition date crept closer, like a train you can hear long before it rounds the bend. Equipment appeared. 2 properties over. A yellow excavator sleeping like a beast in tall grass. A flatbed stacked with barrier fencing. A portable toilet set coyly behind a hedge. He woke before dawn and stood at his window and watched mist lift from the lake like a veil from a face that doesn't know it's being watched. He walked to the barn and touched a door his father had rehung after a winter wind twisted the hinges. He pressed his palm to the scar where paint had been and was again faintly darker in a shape that still read like a command. He spoke aloud to no one, not because he expected an answer but because some words deserve air. This is ours. It had been said before him. It would need to be said after. The path to the dam knew his steps by now. Brush remembered the line of his leg. Stones welcomed the weight they had learned. The wheel lay in its pocket of earth and concrete. The metal's orange-brown bloom more texture than decay. He crouched and let his fingers curl around it. Not to turn. Not yet. But to know the truth of it. The metal was cold. It always was. Even in heat. It felt like a promise that wouldn't sweeten. He measured the arc in his head the way his father had taught him. Quarter turn, listen. Pause, feel. Half turn. Wait for the pitch to change. He didn't need a gauge to know what would happen. The lake would descend not like a fall but like a decision. A line retreating inch by inch, exposing the places the manicured shore had concealed. Docks would list and then tilt. The resort's perfect photographs would become fossils of a moment that couldn't be stitched back together by spin. He thought of consequences. They arrived in order, efficient as an assembly line. The cuffs, the cell, the trial where adjectives would be chosen like tools: reckless, unstable, dangerous. He pictured a jury blinking at a screen while a lawyer pointed to slides that rendered his life into bullets. Notice sent, notice ignored, violation documented, threat inferred. Nowhere would there be a line for the nights a man holds his breath beside smoke on his porch and the town tells him to exhale. The knot in his chest drew tight enough to hold a man upright. The decision wasn't a flare. It was a slow ignition, the moment when embers decide to become flame. He stood and wiped soil from his knees and looked up at the lake one last time as if asking it whether it was ready to tell the truth. On the way home, the SUV returned, idling at the turn like punctuation. He passed it without pause. He ate standing at the counter a heel of bread, a slice of cheese, and then walked the rooms of his house, touching the edges that had kept him safe. The porch rail still wore the shape of heat. He laid his palm on it until skin met memory. The night came blue and deep. Crickets tuned the dark. Somewhere across the water, music lifted, sequined, and careless. He took his flashlight, not because he needed to see, But because ceremony matters when you're about to change a story, he went down the path and did not stop. He went to the wheel and did not hesitate. He placed both hands where generations had placed theirs, not just his father, not just his grandfather, but the unnamed laborers whose backs had taught this county what endurance costs. He drew in breath that filled him to his ribs, and then the world narrowed to iron and will. The wheel resisted first, the way old things test your seriousness. He leaned, not with rage but with resolve. It groaned low, alive. Beneath him, water shifted its tone, a choir finding a lower note. The lake answered, almost imperceptibly at first, then clear. The surface tweaked, the shore breathed in, the docks complained in wood language. He stopped there, holding possibility in his grip. He could turn back. He could pretend this had not begun. He could wake before dawn and find the barn gone and tell himself there had been no other path, or he could finish the sentence that had been writing itself on his land for years. Behind him, the barn stood like a witness waiting to be called. Before him, the wheel waited like a judge who had already heard enough. He took another breath, long, deliberate, final in its calm, and the valve began to turn. The metal wheel groaned under Marcus's hands, a deep, echoing complaint that seemed to shake the very earth beneath him. The tremor of water below responded almost immediately. A subtle shiver at first, then a ripple that raced across the lake's surface, like a secret being revealed. For decades, the lake had reflected only wealth, only power, only the curated illusion of perfection that the HOA demanded. Tonight, it reflected something else entirely: consequence. Every inch of water that obeyed Marcus's hands was a line drawn in resistance, a statement no report or letter could erase. The first inch of retreat was almost imperceptible, yet Marcus felt it deeply. The subtle drop gave him a grim smile. He imagined the contractors arriving the next morning, expecting to raise his barn, only to find the earth beneath their machines sucked dry and cracked. He pictured the HOA board members, the men and women who had dictated how he could live, staring across the lake at their pristine paradise unraveling before them. Their jewel was being reclaimed not by law, not by agreement, but by sheer undeniable action. Even if temporary, it was theirs no longer. The waterline fell steadily. Docks leaned at impossible angles, their supports groaning under the strain. Small boats tipped and scraped against the exposed mud, their cheerful owners' laughter replaced with frantic shouting. The perfectly manicured lawns that bordered the lake now gave way to sticky, gray mud, the seams of control unraveling. Crabs scuttled for cover. Minnows flitted desperately along the shallow edges. The lake, calm for decades, now quivered in disbelief. Screams rose from the cabins closest to the water. Guests stumbled out onto porches, phones raised to capture what they assumed was a staged spectacle. Someone shouted it must be a prank, but there was no trick, no illusion. The lake was dying, or more accurately, being forced to surrender to its true master. Marcus did not feel triumph. He felt the accumulated weight of every choice denied to him over his life. Every note, every letter, every drone, every glance that said you do not belong here pressed into his chest. History itself, patient and immovable, demanded acknowledgement. Behind him, the barn stood like a sentinel. Its wood gleamed faintly in the moonlight, battered but proud, a witness to decades of storms, neglect, and now deliberate erasure attempts. Marcus took a long, steadying breath. Each turn of the wheel was a statement. This is mine. This is our legacy. You cannot erase it. And then the sirens began. A T first. A faint hum, almost swallowed by the retreating water's whisper. Then louder, closer, the shrill cry of authority cutting through the night. Lights flickered across the trees, sirens reflecting off the lake like warning flares. Marcus knew the law would not see this as resistance. They would call it reckless, dangerous, illegal. Yet he could not stop. He would not. The first deputy arrived, breathless, eyes wide at the scene. Step away from the valve, he shouted, hand hovering over his holster. The incredulity in his voice was clear. Hands on the wheel. Marcus froze, not out of fear, but because this was the apex. The confrontation between one man and a system that had long sought to crush him was now fully realized. He looked at the deputy, then at the lake. In each cabin across the water, panic flashed in faces. Boats were grounded. The waterline receded inch by inch, unstoppable. "I'm not hurting anyone," Marcus said, his voice steady, cutting through the rush of water and rising tension. "I'm keeping what's mine." The deputies advanced cautiously, but the lake responded to his hands, glinting silver in the moonlight, as if acknowledging his claim. Marcus remembered the letters, the anonymous notes, the trespassing strangers, the spray paint, the officials who refused to see him. The barn, the dam, the lake, they were all symbols now. Symbols of endurance, defiance, and the cost of erasure based solely on the color of his skin. The second deputy arrived, calling for backup. The words were clipped, urgent. Lights reflected off the water's surface, casting dancing shadows across the banks. Guests shouted, waving phones and pointing. Someone had called the news. Another had begun streaming live. Marcus felt the first tendrils of fear, but it sharpened him, made his focus razor-edged. He could not let go until the lake itself had declared its truth. History cannot be bulldozed. Dignity cannot be fined into submission. Finally, the sheriff arrived, imposing and deliberate, disbelief etched into his face. "Step away from the valve, Mr. Johnson," he boomed. "This is your last warning." Marcus hesitated. He turned slowly, deliberately, from the officers to the lake. Docks were now precarious. Small boats grounded, and mud coated the edges. In thick, heavy blankets, the resort's picture-perfect image had fractured. He exhaled, feeling weeks, months, years of tension concentrate in a single, deliberate breath. Then, as if guided by a whisper from his grandfather, Marcus released the wheel. His hands rose in surrender, letting the law take hold. Cuffs clicked around wrists that had just guided water itself. He allowed himself to be led from the dam, not meekly, but with measured dignity. Each step was a declaration. The system could control consequences, but not truth. By dawn, the lake had begun to refill naturally, yet the memory of its retreat lingered. News crews swarmed, neighbors whispered, visitors gawked. Some called Marcus reckless, others heroic. He needed none of their judgment. He had made his statement. The barn still stood, and so did he. Inside the county jail, Marcus reflected on the events. His thoughts were heavy but lucid. The barn, the lake, the dam, they were more than structures. They were reminders that he existed in a world constantly questioning his right to exist. The injustice he faced was systemic, insidious, disguised in civility and procedure. But tonight, he had reminded the town of one truth. No system can erase history without acknowledgement, and no edict can erase identity without resistance. He thought of the children who would never comprehend the subtle cruelty of society unless someone like him bore witness. He considered neighbors who had quietly supported him, courage muted by fear. He thought of every person of color made to feel small in a world promising equality but delivering control. And he wondered, how many more times must this story repeat before the world finally listens? Outside, the morning sun glittered off the lake, acknowledging its keeper. The barn, weathered yet unbowed, caught the light. Marcus's actions would be dissected endlessly, some seeing anger, some desperation. Yet beneath it all was truth, the truth of human dignity standing against erasure. His lawyer arrived mid-morning. "The charges are serious," she said softly. Marcus nodded. He would not minimize his actions. They had been deliberate, measured, morally imperative. If the courts could not see the systemic abuse pushing him to this, the world could. And perhaps that visibility was the first step toward accountability. In the coming weeks, the town would not be the same. Neighbors who had whispered in shadows reconsidered what they condoned. The HOA, which thrived on silence and compliance, faced scrutiny it had never known. Marcus bore consequences, yes, but also the knowledge that standing for oneself, even in a suppressive world, carries its own form of victory. Marcus's story is more than a barn or one man. It is the story of countless lives measured against arbitrary standards, identities policed under the guise of rules. It is about courage in the face of systems blind to injustice. And it is about history demanding recognition, whether people want it or not. He emerged from that night unchanged in body but profoundly transformed in spirit. Fear, anger, systemic bias, they lingered, shadows refusing to fade. Yet within that shadow was clarity. The barn still stood, the water still moved. Resistance was not defiance, it was declaration. Walking through the quiet town, Marcus saw neighbors murmuring, expressions a mix of curiosity, fear, awe. Some whispered apologies for unspoken complicity. Others silently acknowledged the courage it took to stand alone. Some, most comfortable in their power, remained obstinate, hoping the memory would fade. But Marcus had started something irreversible. The lake would recover. The barn would survive. The town would remember, even reluctantly, that denying dignity has a cost. The eruption of truth. That evening, Marcus rested his hand on the barn door, feeling the rough grain beneath his palm. He whispered, not to anyone but the long line of ancestors paving his path, "We are here. We endure. We will not be erased." And the question remained, echoing in the hearts of all who bore witness: how many more barns, lakes, and voices must rise before the world finally listens?